Welcome, and it's great to be with you. What a magnificent panel. I have the honour to chair three people I admire immensely. Niall Ferguson deserves a sort of Victoria Cross, because this is the second time he's submitted to being a panellist under my discipline. Although I must say the last time he was extremely Bolshevik about everything. It's a fantastic day we've got. This little panel, just before I switch to my co-panellists, I just want to offer you a very, very brief thought on my take on the civilisational moment we face. I don't think we can get away from this morning without confronting this fact. Our four adversaries, China, Russia, Iran and North Korea, have all moved to wartime economies. They are a much more powerful set of adversaries than we faced in Nazi Germany, in alliance with the Soviet Union and then Imperial Japan. And none of our societies is doing anything remotely adequate to meet the challenge. But for the subject we're considering today, the thought I want to offer you is this. Those four nations all follow the most bizarre and crazy ideological systems known to man. Juche in North Korea, what Kevin Rudd has rightly labelled Marxist-Leninist nationalism in Xi Jinping's China. And yet they are all full of self-confidence. Their leadership passionately believes in their crazy schemes. How is it that they're so self-confident, whereas we're the inheritors of an infinitely better, much more human tradition, and yet we've lost all confidence in it? Now, I think it's a long historical process of disenchantment which has robbed our culture of transcendence, purpose, beauty, even of the meaning of beauty. But here's the good news. The solutions lie with the Australian people, who are bursting to be free of this madness and bubbling up with their own solutions which they're imposing on their leaders. I'll give you a couple of examples. Despite tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars of propaganda, all kinds of government intimidation, corporate woke madness, nonetheless the Australian people responded to the magnificent leadership that Jacinta gave us and voted no, 60%, against having a racial category in the Australian Constitution. I think that was a vote of love, that we were not going to imprison anybody in a racial category, that we were all going to be equal citizens together. Our inheritance, there's certainly no religious test in our politics, but our inheritance rests upon the Jewish and Christian traditions and the hateful, foul anti-Semitism which we've seen spread in our society, like all Western societies, after October 7. It's not because we conceive of the Jew as the other. It's a form of the ideological self-loathing in our addled, symbol-wielding class. It's because we see the Jew as one of us, as part of us. Jews are part of our story, and we hate them because we hate ourselves. Now, our education system, of course, is plagued by postmodern plagues. It's riddled with asinine, addled, agitprop, ideological madness at every turn. Yet hundreds and thousands of ordinary Australian mums and dads are founding new Christian schools, new classical schools. Bible colleges are becoming accredited university colleges. Christian universities are emerging even in Australia. You can feel the Australian people yearning to break free of this madness. There is still a tremendous constituency for the basic decencies and for common sense. Despite all the propaganda against the Western military tradition, nothing is more popular in Australia than Anzac Day, and nothing sells better in bookstores than Australian military history. Now, Western civilisation is open to everyone. It's a creedal idea, not an ethnic idea. In Australia, we welcome the stranger. We intermarry across racial lines at a tremendous rate. There's still a great constituency of basic decency, but people do need leadership. They need leaders out front to show them the way. Now, as I say, there's no religious test, but in the greatest of the great books of our civilisation, there is a promise which we can take some consolation from. And I'm paraphrasing the promise in the gospel, but it's basically this. If we don't give up, we will never lose. Now, having had my little say, I want to switch across to my magnificent co-panellists, and I want to address my first question to Jacinta Price, whom we all admire so much. Jacinta, my sense of the no vote was that it was a positive vote of love and inclusion, and certainly it was not a vote against Aboriginal Australians in any way. But how do you see that vote?
Oh, you'll probably find it strange, but I agree. The Australian people, the sense that I got certainly travelling the length and breadth of the country was that Australians felt so much like they wanted to contribute positively to the lives of Indigenous Australians. And at first, when we learned of the voice, the Albanese government bringing the voice to the Australian people in the form of the referendum, there was that sense among the Australian people, yes, we want to support, okay, this seems like a good idea to begin with, because we do want to support Indigenous Australians, particularly marginalised Indigenous Australians. But then once the Australian people learned that there was very little detail involved, and then it wasn't what they were expecting of it, they didn't think it was the right way to go forward to support Indigenous Australians. And there has been an incredible amount of goodwill toward improving the lives of marginalised Indigenous Australians in this country, but the proposal just didn't cut the mustard for the Australian people. And the realisation that we were going to be taking a step back from the 1967 referendum, where it was about equality and bringing Australians together and treating Indigenous Australians as equal to everybody else, this would be dividing us along the lines of race in our constitution. Australians, being pragmatic and you know, driven by common sense, thought, no, this isn't a good idea. And I think, you know, for many of us, and most Australians, in some way, we're all connected. We all have, you know, the family members who are Indigenous. You know, we're part of interracial marriages, if you like. The majority, there's those who identify as Indigenous in this country. 80% of those who identify are married to non-Indigenous people in this country. So the concept, I think, settled in for Australians that this is going to, how is this going to work out in practical terms for Indigenous Australians? I mean, for my family, how was my youngest, my stepson, who isn't Indigenous, going to fare, you know, in comparison to his 3 older brothers who are Indigenous? And that began to dawn in the minds of Australians. And I truly believe that, particularly as the campaign went on and coming face to face and having conversations with Australians said, no, this is about division, and we don't want division. We're a nation where we band together. When the going gets tough, we band together, and we do have an Australian spirit. And I think in more recent times, that spirit has been diminished because of the politics of radical leftists who want to categorise us and label us all and clump us all together in particular groups. And I think the worst 2 groups are the oppressed and the oppressors. And Aboriginal people were being put in the group of the oppressed. And I didn't think that that didn't bode well with the Australian people, that concept. And so I think this was a turning point for Australians to say, we're not going to stand for this. We're not going to stand for being divided. And the vote was no to the voice, but it was yes to love and acceptance and being unified as a country and starting to a point where we could begin to rebuild as a country and start doing things together. And I think from that we've seen now a pushback on things like welcome to country, which has just become a sort of a throwaway, you know, acknowledgement to country, sort of throwaway lines at the beginning of every meeting, every event, every aeroplane flight. It's just become nonsensical now, and Australians want common sense, practical ways forward that really brings that spirit of Australia together. And I feel like the outcome did reignite the Australian spirit, and I feel as though it encouraged Australians to stand up against the gaslighting and the bullying of the far left that we've all had to endure. And I can tell you now that I knew with every millimetre of my being that I was never going to support the concept of the voice, because I understood how damaging it was going to be for our country, but particularly so for marginalised Indigenous Australians who would have been relegated to a voice. It would have been a handball for the current Prime Minister or anyone in power to say, no, that's an Aboriginal issue, we're going to handball you over to the voice and let the voice deal with you. And that is completely un-Australian as far as I'm concerned.
So, Jacinta, thanks very much for that answer, and recalls an earlier Australian vernacular that Australians had no time for ratbags, and the biggest ratbags of all were basically Ponzi left-wing pseudo-intellectuals who tried to lecture about a reality about which they understood nothing. And rather than engage them, Australians would just dismiss them as all that ratbaggery. We got no time for all that ratbaggery. Now, Neil, you never have to encounter ratbaggery in your rarefied environment, but how would you place the Australian debate in the international context of which you're such a master?
You know, Greg, it's almost worth flying 12 hours just to hear the word ratbaggery. Not to mention Ponzi. These are words rarely heard on the Stanford campus. That's fascinating listening to Jacinta and thinking that all over the Anglosphere, to use a term Roger Scruton loved, the same battles are playing out. It varies from place to place, but broadly speaking, if you think of American campuses as the factories of wokeism, the fundamental goal is to divide. Ideas like intersectionality, the hierarchies of victimhood, are really designed to fragment our communities into mutually antagonistic groups, and thereby to deny individuals their identity and their commonality. So I think the battles that have been fought here have their analogues in the United States, in the United Kingdom, as well as in New Zealand and Canada. One of the reasons it's worth flying all this way is to be part of a global conversation. How do we reassert the primacy of individual liberty and individual identity, the idea of a society in which we're all equal before the law, regardless of our pigmentation, our religious orientation, all of that. This is a very fundamental battle, and I think it's happening everywhere in the English-speaking world and indeed beyond. But there's a strategic dimension to this, Greg, which I know you think about and you alluded to briefly. We have a battle going on within our societies, but we also confront a really serious external threat. And I don't think there's still enough acknowledgement of how dangerous the new axis of authoritarian powers is. I called it the axis of ill will a few years ago, to distinguish it from the axis of evil, which was a largely non-existent rhetorical trope of 2002. The axis of ill will unites China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. This is a formidable coalition, particularly because of China's vast economic resources. And I can say, having recently visited Kyiv just a few weeks ago, that axis of ill will is wreaking havoc in Ukraine. And it has also been wreaking havoc in Israel, and it can, and I think at some point will, wreak havoc in Taiwan, which of course geographically is a bigger preoccupation of Australians than Ukraine and Israel. So we face not only an internal threat, this threat to decompose our society into warring minority groups, we also face one of the biggest external threats since the end of the Cold War, So that's, I think, what ARC is about, both internal and external threats, and we're not addressing them seriously enough. AUKUS exists, but, and this is the last point I'll make, neither Australia nor the United Kingdom nor the US is yet making a sufficient effort to deter the axis of ill will from further aggression. I'll leave
Neil,
it there.
thank you for that answer. And I must say, we have a very special talent in Australia. We identify great, big, huge problems, look them square in the eye, decide they're too difficult to deal with, and go and deal with something on the side of no consequence whatsoever. So we have no defence force to speak of in Australia. We have the most pathetic, worthless, powerless, impotent, hopeless defence force which anyone has ever imagined in the history of the human race.
Can you tell us how you really feel?
And as a result, we spend all our life debating nuclear submarines, which are going to come along in Star Trek time, when we're all, by the time they come along, we'll all either be speaking Mandarin or China will be ruled by the Christian Democratic Party, and the biggest building in Beijing will be the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. But so it's really good of you to bring us back to reality, that this threat is actually going to happen in our lifetimes, not. But whether either side of politics can come to grips with it, who knows?
Well, Greg, just briefly, I guess even shorter the time frame. I think it's not accidental that Bill Burns, the Director of Central Intelligence, has said twice last year that according to US intelligence, Xi Jinping told the Chinese military to be ready for war by 2027. So the next US presidential term is highly likely to see a Taiwan crisis. That means that much of the discussion, as you say, about AUKUS is on the wrong time frame. We need urgently to improve our deterrence in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. And we need to recognize the extent to which the hostile authoritarian powers are acting together. We're no longer dealing with separate regional conflicts. We face a global challenge to Western primacy, to American-led primacy.
Absolutely. My last thought on this before I switch to John is that, Kevin Rudd, our former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, has just published a book, a brilliant, very, very fine book, which I can recommend without hesitation, on Xi Jinping, how Chinese nationalism, Chinese Marxist nationalism is transforming China and the world. And one of the points he makes is that Xi is completely ideological, the Chinese Communist Party is completely ideological, it believes in its crackpot ideology, and it believes that the ideology has universal application for the whole of mankind, and it believes its historic mission is to transform the world in its image. And I don't know how the government can sort of have its ambassador produce a book like that and then still go on the way it is. But that's just one of the many mysteries that we face. John, I wanted to ask you this. It seems to me that the Australian people still have a great constituency for the common decencies and for common sense. And they still have a sort of atavistic inherent yearning for something decent and something good. Not only that, I'd say people arguing the sort of case that you argue, and Jacinta and Neil, they have a great advantage because they're arguing things which actually resonate with the truths which lie deep within every human heart. But how do you marry this paradox that we want to tell people Australia is actually a pretty good country and a pretty good place, but we also want to face up to the really shocking derelictions of public policy which we're dealing with today?
Well, thank you. I think it was Churchill who said that all you need to know about statecraft can be learnt from history. And I would begin by saying, in Neil's company it's a pretty easy thing to say, that understanding history is incredibly important, but we're not very good at it. And the amazing story of Maria Yalamundi, that I dare say almost none of you had heard of, reflects the fact that as Stuart Piggin, a remarkable Australian historian who's here with us and has written extensively on this, one of our great problems in Australia is not so much that we don't know our history, is that we've never actually discovered it. And one of the things that I think if you understand Australian history you will discover is that there's nothing more formidable than an Australian who recognises he or she has to fight for something that is good. The first turning point in the Second World War was in the North African desert. I think that would be fair to say. The Australian 9th Division was there, and General Rommel commented to the effect that these were the Australians were the finest soldiers the Empire has produced. If he wanted to take hell, he'd send the New Zealanders in first, then the Australians would be sent in to hold it, and you'd never get it back because they're tough and resilient. But on the other hand, other commentators have observed that whilst we're formidable when we recognise action is needed, we are remarkably lackadaisical and remarkably disinterested when everything seems to be all right, mate. And so you see our greatest weakness and our greatest strength contrasted in a way that frankly horrifies me. I grew up with a father who'd been given up for dead on the battlefield, and right to the dying days, he'd wake up in the middle of the night screaming, "Get down, you fool, you're going to get hit," when the Germans found the range of their anti-tank unit. And he was never able to escape that. So I've been lucky enough to be in a generation, I'm a mid-boomer, that's missed all of that. But I have a bit of an inkling at a personal level of the terrible price you can pay if you don't prepare. And my greatest plea of all to Australians would be stop ignoring the lessons of history, and for what it's worth to today's leaders is do some leading. Stop responding to the opinion polls, stop responding to wokeism, and recognise that our very freedoms cannot be taken for granted, and leadership means you lead.
So John, that very fine exposition reminds me of the great phrase about Australia, that no country deals with misfortune better and no country deals with good fortune worse than Australia. And we've had a lot of good fortune over the last few decades, which is why we've governed so badly. Now, we've got a little over 2 minutes left, and I might ask each of the panellists to give us a takeaway thought from today. I might ask you, Jacinta, as a great Australian leader, how do you feel about Australia just looking forward?
Optimistic. I think we're ready to stare down the naysayers and rebuild our country. And, you know, I always look forward to a fight.
God bless you. Now, I know your husband is a wonderful Scotsman, but we Irish like a brawl as well, you know. And the other thing about bad news is it's very good for newspapers. So we don't mind a bit of a mess one way or another. Neil, looking out on the West, what's your net assessment? Are we in the fight with a good shot? Are we going backwards? What's your net assessment?
Well, my message is that leadership is important, and John was right about that, but we also need to act at the grassroots. The most important message I have for people here at ARC is be active citizens, because the threats to our freedoms don't just come in at the top level, they come in within your school, your kid's school. They'll turn up in your college campus, your alma mater, and you've got to be ready to fight the ground game to make sure that crazy ideas, whether it's about race or about gender, don't become part of the schools, the universities, the educational system that you have relied on and that you're sending your children or grandchildren to. So leadership, yes, we need it, and it needs to be strong. But the followership is just as important, and that's what ARC is all about. Each and every one of you can do more of the fighting Jacinta just talked about in your own daily lives, and at work too. When the work director of human resources decides that it's time to do a little bit of intersectionality training, say no. Just say no to that stuff. And I think if we all do that, we'll have followership as well as leadership.
Yeah. And John, you have a beautiful family, lovely adult kids and wonderful grandkids. When you dandle your grandkids on your knee, what do you think of the future for them?
I think my response to that would be to say, certainly it energises me, but I think in an age which is surprisingly disinterested or even hostile to the best interests of our kids, I can't think of a policy area that we ought not to approach with an attitude of what will this mean for our children? Economic policy, environmental policy, defence policy, tax policy, dare I say it, fiscal policy and monetary policy, and our disgusting willingness to live beyond our means and engage in intergenerational theft. So let's see it through the eyes of our kids and our grandkids, because as Tim Costello once brilliantly put it, our forebears came here full of hope, risking everything in leaky boats to get to the other side of the world, and they arrived to snakes, droughts, floods, the lot, you know, they happened even in the days before climate change. Our parents hoped that they could get their way through the Great Depression and the Second World War and all those sorts of things, what the Americans call the Great Generation. We're reducing ourselves where we hope for a good time tonight. Let's hope and work for a future for our kids and our grandkids. That's what it needs to be about.
Thank you so much. Now, everybody, we want you to feel positive at the end of this panel, and I'm reminded of the words of one of the great Australian poets. But by the way, if we ever have time, we ought to discuss the 1950s, the greatest decade in Australian history, full of artistic achievement. One of our great poets from the 1950s, James Macaulay, at a very dark time in the Cold War, wrote a marvellous poem, and he finished with the words, and Macaulay was fully engaged. He was Arc Volume 1, so to speak, and he said, he finished his poem with words to the effect, despite everything that can be said against it, what a time this is to be alive in. We've got everything to fight for. As my friends in the Air Force would say, it's a target-rich environment. There's plenty to do. Let's go and have some coffee, and thank you to my magnificent panel today.